This is our special interview. As this invasion on Ukraine continues by Russia, the refugees are fleeing the country, crossing over into different countries. So how dire is the situation and what can be done to help the people of Ukraine? Well, let's find out. We have invited Joel Voss, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Toledo, to speak on this issue. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, so first of all, can you tell us about the situation at hand right now?
Yeah, for refugees, the situation is quite dire. So as you've noticed, the Russian military has increased the number of bombardments that they're using. They're indiscriminately attacking civilians and civilian buildings, and they've broken a ceasefire. So all in all, it's exceptionally dire.
Yes. Well, which countries are the refugees headed into? I know Poland, they've taken in many, many refugees, right?
Yeah, Poland's taken a little over a third, I would say, right now. So in total, it's about 1.5 million, I think, is the estimate, with Poland having between 500 and 600,000. Outside of Poland, though, you have other neighbors of Ukraine, including Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and Romania, who are also taking in refugees. And then soon you'll see them being spread out throughout Europe, including Calais, France, for example, so they can cross to the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, etc.
Well, I'm sure many people have seen the footage, and we've seen refugees, trying to get to the borders by car, by train, on foot. What does it look like right now on the ground?
Yeah, well, they're doing everything they can to get out and to get out safely, right? So that means that they are traveling by trains, buses, personal cars, and there are stories of lots of them walking multiple kilometers by foot as well. So they're essentially doing everything they can to flee.
Well, when we talk about refugees, what do you think are the most imminent risks or dangers?
Well, I think this depends on where you're located at. So if you're near the fighting, it's clearly the Russian military. If you were in Mariupol, for example, and you were trying to flee during the humanitarian pause, the Russian military is your biggest threat. In Kiev, it's the same. But as you move further away from the fighting, it turns into other things like the weather, right? It's winter in Europe. A lack of money because the banks, there were a run on the banks right before the conflict started. And just general health concerns like COVID, for example.
Yes. Well, in terms of the countries that are providing refuge to Ukrainians, what kind of services or things are they providing for these displaced people?
Sure. So you can think of it in two steps. Okay. The first step is to provide emergency services, right? And so this includes healthcare for people who are injured or sick. It includes shelter, food, water, etc. In addition to that, you see a lot of people donating toys to children and things to try to at least make this as pleasant as possible. I know that's a weird word to use in this case. And then the next sort of step is that you'll see legal aid to help people get to different countries. And then also if the conflict progresses for a while, you'll see schooling provided and sort of more long-term services that you see in Syria, for example, or in Kenya, et cetera.
Well, how long can displaced people stay, generally speaking, in these temporary camps?
Yeah, so the EU has come out already and they've granted Ukrainian citizens and Ukrainian permanent residents at least 1 year of not citizenship, but 1 year 1 year's right to live and work inside the EU. And then if the conflict progresses, it can be an additional 2 years added on to that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, so in essence, they can stay there as long as the conflict is ongoing, right? They'll ultimately extend this if it continues for a long time. But the general idea is that you want to get refugees to places that are safe and not in camps.
Ah, yes. And for listeners who are joining us in the midst of this, we're speaking with Professor Joel Voss on the status of refugees, displaced people who are trying to flee Ukraine. And you did mention Mariupol, Professor, a little while ago. And it does seem that, there was some sort of ceasefire that was agreed upon by the two sides. To ensure the safe humanitarian corridor. But as we've been hearing and seeing with some firsthand reporting and even some really, gruesome footage, that civilians are indeed being attacked. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It looks like Russia broke the ceasefire. Russia, of course, claimed that Ukraine broke it first, but from the videos and the reports that we're seeing on the ground, you're seeing tanks being aimed at fleeing citizens from Mariupol, people being shot at, and all sorts of violence directed towards refugees.
Mm. Yeah. And what about this whole story about Russia offering further humanitarian corridors? But apparently the corridors are talking about with exits into Belarus, which is, of course, an ally of Russia, or directly into Russia. And, of course, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has called this, quote-unquote, immoral. What's your stance on this?
Well, I think it's not really a genuine humanitarian corridor, right? No, Russia has some refugees from Ukraine, especially those in the east, and yes. Belarus has maybe 1,000 or so. But people don't want to flee into the countries that are attacking them,
right? And
so this is something that's going to be rejected outright.
Do you think that in terms of the status of the refugees that we're only going to see the numbers grow? Because we're saying right now, experts say it's maybe at minimum 1.5 million refugees. But it does seem like this might be a prolonged affair.
Yeah, I think it's going to grow. The Office for the High Commissioner of Refugees has estimated that it could be up to 10 million, which would be a little under a quarter of all Ukrainians. It's an incredibly high number. And as everyone's reporting, right, this is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, refugee crisis since World War II. And so I think you're going to see these numbers dramatically increase, especially as Russian forces move further and further inward into Ukraine.
Well, I also want to address this issue. Some experts seem to think that Russia has committed war crimes already. The International Criminal Court has already, started an investigation to pursue, these accusations along those avenues. Do you think there's a valid argument that war crimes may have been committed already?
Despite the United States not wanting to use the term, I do think that war crimes have been committed. So if you look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, they clearly define out what types of crimes could be war crimes. And this includes targeting civilians and targeting civilian objects like power plants, for example. And there's clear evidence that that's happened. Ukraine's not a member of the ICC, and nor is Russia. But nevertheless, Ukraine gave jurisdiction to the court back when Russia annexed Crimea the first time in 2014. And so the prosecutor of the ICC have actually been looking at this issue since since November 2013. And they've already found evidence that it could be pursued. And so I think you're just going to see more evidence that will come out that they can pursue war crimes. And on top of the prosecutor looking at this issue, states have also asked them to look at it, like Lithuania, for example.
Well, aside from, people actually going to the front of, battle, what can people do, lay people do in terms of helping these refugees right now?
Yeah, well, the main thing, I think, is to pressure your politicians, if you can do that, wherever you're at, and tell them that you're not happy with this. You can refrain from buying Russian goods and assets. You could, of course, donate to refugee organizations, and there are many of them, including American ones and South Korean ones, et cetera. So I think that's the first start, right? Like, send resources to these people because they're going to need it. They're in it for the long haul.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts and expertise on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Thank you, Professor.
My pleasure.
This was Professor Joel Voss, and we talked about the refugee issues that many displaced people are facing as we speak. And of course, we're hearing about some of the heartbreaking stories, even of this, if the reports are correct, an 11-year-old boy whose parents had to stay behind in Ukraine, making it into Slovakia on his own. He is reportedly safe and sound, but just the heartbreaking stories that are out there.